My name is Jonathan Harris, and I'd like to tell you the story of one of the most daring and complex moves I've ever witnessed: the overland transportation of a vintage RAF Canberra bomber. This wasn't just any old plane. It was an iconic British aircraft from the 1950s, a jet bomber celebrated for its long-range, high-altitude capabilities. Now, however, it was grounded by corrosion and needed to be moved over 250 miles across Britain, from a hangar in Coventry to a brand-new aviation museum in the seaside town of Newquay, Cornwall. I was there to document every nail-biting moment, every setback, and every triumph. Over the course of a few weeks, I shadowed a dedicated team of aviation engineers and heavy haulage experts as they painstakingly dismantled this once glorious aircraft, once able to soar at more than 580 miles per hour, and loaded its massive parts onto multiple trucks for a 2-day journey across the country. Let me walk you through the drama, step by step. A vintage bomber with a glorious past. When you first set eyes on a Canberra bomber, you can't help but be impressed. Even in the dim light of the old hangar where it was stored, its large frame and distinctive shape brought to mind the golden age of British aviation. This particular Canberra was once a training aircraft for the Royal Air Force, RAF, for more than half a century. In its heyday, it could climb higher than any other bomber of its time, outmaneuver radar detection, and carry over 3.5 tons of payload. Built in the late 1940s and first flown in 1949, the Canberra quickly became one of the RAF's most significant success stories. Nearly 1,000 were constructed in total, serving in the air forces of 17 nations. By the mid-1950s, the Canberra had even broken altitude records, soaring to heights no other bomber had reached before. It was a triumph of British engineering, fast, efficient, and ahead of its time. Mike Collett, the owner of this particular Canberra, is an aviation entrepreneur who made his fortune running cargo and passenger airlines. A lifelong aviation enthusiast, he had purchased and restored several iconic post-war aircraft to preserve them for future generations. Among his fleet were various vintage jets, transports, and trainers, some from the 1950s and 60s. His vision was to gather these restored aircraft in a new museum in Newquay called the Classic Air Force Museum, where they would be preserved, displayed, and, in some cases, flown for public demonstrations. But one key piece was missing from the museum's collection: this Canberra bomber. It was the crown jewel, the aircraft Mike had longed to show off. Unfortunately, it hadn't flown for years. Its engines were old, and its airframe had begun to corrode, making it unsafe to take to the skies. So if it couldn't fly, there was only one option: transport it by road. And that's where our saga truly begins. The team assembles to pull off such an ambitious move. Mike enlisted Richard Parr and David Adamson, two aviation engineers who had worked on relocating more than 40 aircraft in the past. Even with their experience, the Canberra would be one of their biggest challenges to date. Alongside them were skilled heavy haulage truckers from Leicester Heavy Haulage, crane supervisors, and specialized escort drivers to navigate the bomber's parts through narrow roads and bustling motorways. When I first met Richard and David, they seemed confident yet cautious. They explained that an aircraft designed for flight often doesn't come apart easily. They'd have to remove both wings, each spanning about 19 meters across the entire wingspan, detach the twin Rolls-Royce jet engines, and separate the tail section from the fuselage. All those components would then be strapped onto flatbed trucks, each piece carefully supported and balanced to prevent damage to this precious, nearly 60-year-old plane. Beginning the dismantling. The first phase involved removing the engines and wings, then draining any leftover fuel. You'd think an aircraft that hadn't flown for years would be empty of fuel, but old jets often have hidden pockets of aviation gas, left over from their final flights or test runs. Draining the fuel turned out to be a dangerous challenge, since even the slightest spark in the hangar could have sparked a massive explosion. In Coventry, I watched David unscrew corroded panels and pry loose jammed bolts. There were hundreds of screws, many rusted from years of neglect. Each one had to be removed or drilled out by hand, a process that took days. While we were there, the team also discovered pockets of fuel that gushed into plastic buckets from pipes hidden inside the wings. At one point, Fuel began to pour out faster than anyone anticipated. It took multiple buckets and a lot of frantic scrambling to ensure that not a single drop got near a spark. The stress level in that hangar skyrocketed. At last, after hours of muscle, elbow grease, and carefully choreographed teamwork, one engine slid free. Then the next engine followed. With those out of the way, the biggest piece of the puzzle, removing the wings, was up next. Each wing weighed about 4.5 tons and was secured by just 8 heavy bolts, which were proving to be unbelievably stubborn. Stubborn bolts and custom cradles. When it came time to remove these wing bolts, Richard and David soon realized that their special extraction tool was cracking. On top of that, the bolts, jammed in place by years of accumulated grease and rust, refused to budge. By the end of one grueling day, they had broken tools, and morale was at an all-time low. "Houston, we have a problem," became the phrase of the hour. Meanwhile, away from the plane, a separate team was welding custom-designed steel cradles. These cradles would hold each wing at just the right angle to slip under bridges on the journey and avoid scraping the ground as the trucks went around corners. Precision was absolutely critical. If the angles were off, the Canberra's wings could be damaged en route. Eventually, with some creative thinking, like reinserting and lubricating the bolts that had already been loosened, Richard and David found a way to evenly distribute the aircraft's weight, reducing the pressure on the remaining stubborn bolts. One by one, those bolts finally gave way. The team could now call in a crane to lift the wings off without inflicting damage. A special visitor. During the dismantling, we had an unexpected visit from David Piper, a retired RAF officer who had logged nearly 3,000 hours flying the Canberra during his long service career. Listening to him recount his time at the controls was a real treat. His eyes lit up when he climbed into the cockpit, as though he could still feel the roar of those Rolls-Royce engines. He spoke of missions that took him across Europe, the Middle East, and even Afghanistan. His passion underscored how important it was to preserve this piece of aviation history. "An aircraft like this should definitely be preserved," he said. "It's up there with the best." His endorsement provided a much-needed morale boost. It reminded everyone why we were investing so much sweat and blood to keep this unique aircraft from being scrapped. Wings off, fuselage loaded. Finally, after 13 weeks of preparation, the big day arrived. The crane lifted each wing off the fuselage. We had to be very careful of the low-hanger roof, since even the slightest jolt could have caused irreparable damage. There was a heart-stopping moment when one wing crashed against the edge of the trailer bed. I heard metal scraping, and I felt my stomach drop. But the damage turned out to be superficial, a bump and a scratch, nothing catastrophic. By the end of that day, both wings were safely tied onto separate trucks, each resting snugly in its custom cradle. The last piece, the longest and heaviest, the 20-meter fuselage, needed the crane as well. Balancing the fuselage without its tail section was no easy feat. At one point, leftover fuel started pouring out again, forcing the team to scramble for more buckets. Then the nose threatened to tip forward because of the uneven weight distribution. In the end, Richard had to use a forklift with extra straps to stabilize the load. Eventually, the fuselage was secured onto its own trailer. The road trip begins. Day 1. Coventry to Bodmin. We were up by 9 a.m. doing one last round of checks on the straps, cables, and tarps. Then it was time to roll. The convoy, comprised of 3 main trucks, each hauling a wing, the fuselage, and auxiliary parts, plus escorts, pulled out of the hangar and onto the narrow streets. I rode in the lead escort vehicle. Our first major challenge was navigating a tight turn in the village of Baggington, with a mini roundabout that forced the entire convoy to pause and block multiple lanes of traffic. Once we hit the motorway, we picked up speed, but only to about 40 miles per hour. Other drivers, many of them holidaymakers heading to the south coast, didn't seem thrilled about having to slow down behind a vintage bomber wing. We could practically hear their exasperated groans through the windshields. Still, we had our job to do. With each hour that passed, ominous clouds drew closer and traffic started thickening. Before long, we were in the middle of a downpour so heavy it reduced visibility to a few meters. We had to slow to a crawl, hazard lights flashing all the way. Eventually we reached Bodmin, our planned overnight stop, at around 9 p.m., later than intended, but still within the legal driving limits. The entire convoy parked up in a designated lay-by. The drivers needed their mandatory rest time before we could complete the final 15-mile leg in the morning. Rain battered the trucks all night, but the well-secured bomber parts remained stable. Day 2. Bodmin to Newquay. The second day dawned cold and gray, but at least the rain had eased. We set out at 6 a.m. sharp, mindful that our route would involve narrow Cornish roads and overgrown hedges, both potential hazards for the plane's high wings. Since it was early, traffic was light, but we still had to remain vigilant for oncoming vehicles. A misjudged turn or a branch scraping the fuselage could have been disastrous. Finally, at 8 a.m., we arrived at the gates of the Classic Air Force Museum in Newquay. I remember the sigh of relief, both mine and the team's, as the trucks turned off the road and onto museum property. There, we were greeted by Trevor Bailey, the museum director, who was just as excited as we were to see the Canberra roll in. Unloading at the museum. Bringing the dismantled bomber onto the museum's tarmac was every bit as delicate as loading it up. Using cranes and forklifts, the team gently lowered the fuselage and wings onto waiting blocks. The museum's own crew, who had cleared space in the hangar area, were eager to begin the restoration process. We had just traveled over 250 miles with one of the UK's most iconic aircraft in pieces, and now it was time to put it back together. A future in the skies. In the months ahead, aviation engineers plan to fully restore the Canberra. They'll reattach the tail section, secure the wings, and install the 2 Rolls-Royce engines, as well as refurbish the interior cockpit and electronics. The ultimate dream is that this spectacular bomber might someday take flight once again, joining the rest of Mike's vintage fleet in the skies above Cornwall, delighting onlookers at air shows and preserving a vital part of Britain's aviation heritage. For now, however, the Canberra rests on the museum's tarmac as a vivid reminder of its storied past. I consider it a privilege to have witnessed this remarkable journey firsthand. The road trip may not have had the same thrill as flight, but it had its own share of drama, tension, and triumph. In many ways, it was a fitting tribute to an aircraft known for groundbreaking achievements, a story of commitment, ingenuity, and the sheer determination of people who love aviation enough to spare no effort in keeping its history alive. Standing by the fuselage in the bright Cornish sun, I felt a sense of awe. The Canberra isn't just a plane, it's a piece of living history, a testament to British engineering, RAF bravery, and the passion of those who refuse to let these stories fade away. Its journey down busy highways, around tight corners, and across rainy motorways proved that even grounded, an aircraft can still inspire adventure. I look forward to the day I see it in the air once more, a symbol of perseverance, and the triumphant roar of British aviation's golden age.